you say Lech Lecha? Or
Yeah, okay, so we're going to do a little bit of Lech Lecha today, the third Torah portion and the birth of Judaism. And after that, we will concentrate more on Vayera, which is this week's Torah portion. Again, thank you for coming. And I'd like to start by introducing some rabbinic hermeneutical concepts, which is a fancy way of saying some principles that the rabbis employ in order to interpret Torah. One of them is called Maaseh Avot Siman Lebanim, which means what happened to our ancestors way back when in antiquity is but an omen for things to come, sometimes centuries and millennia thereafter, for us, the Jewish people. So one example is, in Parashat Lech Lecha, Abraham and Sarah are going to descend to Egypt. They're going to immigrate from Israel, Canaan, to Egypt. Spiritually, whenever you move away from Israel, it's considered a descent, and when you go up to Israel, it's an aliyah, it's an ascent from a spiritual standpoint, not necessarily from a socio-economic or geopolitical standpoint. And so we have this rabbinic concept of Maaseh Avot Siman Lebanim. What happens to our ancestors historically oftentimes reiterates itself in similar ways many generations thereafter in Jewish history. There was a writer who once said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. There are similarities. Another rabbinic concept is called Smichut Parshiot. Smichut Parshiot means when there's one story in the Torah, and immediately after it there's another story following it, and great commentators like Rashi, they see a connecting thread between the two stories. So what I want to tell you is that in the towards the end of Parshat Noach, really at the very end of Parshat Noach, with the Maftir, the last few verses, we have the story of Terach, who was Abraham's father, and he decided to immigrate from Ur Kasdim, current-day Iraq, to Israel. And he took his sons and his daughters-in-law and his grandson, and he booked first-class tickets for the airport in Ur Kasdim, and they started heading towards Israel. They started traveling towards Canaan, Israel, and they came to a place called Haran, and they set there. And it is there in Haran that Abram's father passed away. And it's only now, when we begin Lech Lecha, the third Torah portion, and the birth of Judaism, that Abraham and Sarah, Avram and Sarai at this point, before their name is given a spiritual upgrade by God to Abraham and Sarah, Avraham v'Sarah, that Abraham and Sarah continue the road to Israel. But we see that his father already started it. And this is a very important life principle, because as parents, we give our children the best that we can. But being human, we're limited. So there are good things that we have to offer, that we give our children. There are other things that we just don't have the capacity. We didn't get from our parents, we didn't learn in the world, so we don't give it to them. And it's their job to continue the journey by themselves and learn new things, emotionally, psychologically, intellectually, spiritually, so that once they are parents, they will do a better job. So Abraham and Sarah, Abram here exemplifies the notion that his parents carried him a certain distance in life and gave him as much as they could. But at some point, they stopped. They didn't have the capacity to give beyond a certain point, and then it was up to Abraham to continue. It brings to mind a story that I once heard from a Talmud professor of mine about how there was this guy in Israel who was brought up in a secular kibbutz and started learning Judaism and became really interested and intrigued, and he went to a yeshiva, and he really solidified himself both in terms of Jewish knowledge and Jewish practice. And one day he told a friend with whom he was studying Talmud, I think I'm going to write a letter to my parents, and it's basically going to be a letter of rebuke. And I'm going to tell them that I feel so cheated and robbed because I've wasted entire decades of my life. I was brought up with zero Torah. I was never learned any of the prayers. My parents never opened a Torah with me. I didn't even know what the weekly Parsha was. I didn't know Shema Yisrael. I didn't know anything. So I'm going to write a letter to my parents and really give it to them. And this guy, the Talmud partner of this guy, was going to write this angry letter to his parents. He told the Rosh Yeshiva, the head of the yeshiva, about it. And the head of the yeshiva invited this guy who was brought up in a kibbutz to his room and said, "Tell me about your parents. What kind of people they are?" He said, "My parents are humanists. They're people who treat everybody with human dignity. They're very kind. They're very honest. They're full of generosity and integrity. They have great moral values and an internal compass. And they always encouraged me to carve out my own path in life." And with time, the Rosh Yeshiva, the rabbi, he made this guy understand that really his parents gave him optimal tools to succeed in his journey in life. So that's something to learn from the end of Noach and the beginning of Lech Lecha. Your parents take you a certain distance. Beyond that, they don't have the capacity. It's up to you, it's up to me, it's up to us to continue the journey forward. And then Lech Lecha, thank you, starts by saying that God tells Avram, Lech Lecha, I want you to go on an inner journey. Lech Lecha, go to yourself. And it comes to teach us, we're called an Am Olam, which means both a global people and an eternal people. And we were the world's first global people traveling, moving from one country to another throughout the centuries incessantly. And what God is telling Abram, and thereby every Jew, is that when we immigrate from one geographical unit to the other, from one geopolitical unit to the other, the point is not just to travel in geographical space, but the point is to travel internally. When we move to this country from Greece, from Iran, from Israel, from Russia, from Poland, from Germany, wherever we came from, to America or to Israel, the idea is that by traveling to a different civilization, a different culture, a different language, a place with different values and mores and norms, that we should use it to enrich and enhance our souls. We're not just moving in order to be politically safe and in order to have more economic and educational opportunities for us and for our children. Ideally, you want to travel through the world also to grow in soul. And so God is telling Abram, I want you to move from your country, that's geographical move, from your homeland, that's a cultural and linguistic move, and from your father's household, meaning the limitation of your parental home, right? Our parents give us what they can, and from that point you're on your own, kid. I want you to be a better parents than your parents were. And I will expect your children in turn to be better parents than you were. To the land that I will show you. This idea of to the land that I will show you comes to tell us that we don't know our life's mission in advance. The more we grow, the more we understand with time what our life will be about. If you would have told me, even in my 20s, that I would be a rabbi in my 40s, I would laugh in your face. You detect your life's mission with time. The more you work on yourself to grow in soul, the more at some point your life's goals actually change. Constantly, right? They constantly change. And then God promises Abraham that all the nations of the world will be blessed through you. And later on, God promises Abraham that he will be the father of many nations, Av Hamon Goim. And this explains why, all monotheistic religions attribute their at least spiritual ancestry to Abraham. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, right? Abraham is also the father of Ishmael, and the Islamic world sees itself as, spiritual heirs of Ishmael. So it comes to teach us that Abraham is really the founding father of all of monotheism. And what's interesting here is that God tells Abraham, I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. And I wrote last week for the Jewish Journal that if you look at Jewish history, every country that welcomed Jews into its midst with open arms was blessed with cultural and scientific and economic growth. And once life became untenable for the Jewish community of that particular country, and Jewish people were persecuted or expelled or worse, massacred, then really historically you start seeing the demise of that world power, like 15th century Spain. So we see that historical dynamic later on in play. In Lech Lecha we have what we call Brit Ben HaMeitzarim, the covenant between the pieces, the perpetual bond and covenant that God makes with Abraham and Sarah. Of course, we have to be selective, because we also want to discuss today this week's Parsha Vayera. So we have the birth of Ishmael, and we really have the continuation of the themes of family strife in the book of Genesis, Bereshit. Adam and Eve blame each other who chose to eat from the fruit from the tree of knowledge. Cain and Abel, fratricide, brother murdering brother. Then it gets ugly between Noah and his kids after the flood, and now we have Sarah, Abram's wife, and the surrogate mother Hagar, Ishmael's mother, starting to feud, and we have this family disintegration ultimately. So we see that this book is about the book of Bereshit, which is the longest book of the Torah. It has 15 Torah portions, is really about family and its discontents. And really, before we get to the Torah, before we receive the Torah, before we become a nation, we have to get family right. And that only happens through Joseph, who exercises the power of forgiveness and supreme emotional intelligence. So it's a message from the Torah that it's really hard to get family right, but it's really foundational and essential for our well-being. Okay? So now let's move on to this week's Torah portion, which is the Torah portion of Vayera. Vayera means then he appeared. God appeared to Abraham. In our book, Parshat Vayera is on page 79, chapter 18, verse 1. So God appears before Abraham because Abraham he was just circumcised. He underwent a Brit Milah, a bris, at the young age of 99. And the Midrash says that God created a desert storm, not to be confused with the first Gulf War, so that Abraham was addicted to unconditional love, to chesed, to loving kindness. So God created, according to this rabbinic story, a desert storm, so that Abraham won't be tempted to invite people to come eat in his house and take care of them. But really we see that he can't resist. He sees three people. Rashi tells us they were nomadic Arabs traveling, and he bows before them, a cultural bow, like the Japanese bow, a bow of respect and welcoming, and tells them, please don't pass by me empty-handed. Please have some water, let me wash your feet, let me and my wife throw something into the microwave and have some delicacies to feed you, and so forth. So by the way, some of the commentators notice that Abraham tells his wife first to make some cattle, some steak, and then butter and milk, and they're perplexed. What is it? Milk after meat? So of course, this is before the Torah was given. So that's one way to understand it. Then we have this fantastic story whereby these people are called malachim, which means angels, and there are two ways to understand it. One is that angels means emissaries, and the other one is that
It's going to be fine. It's going to be fine in the kingdom.
and one is that angels are spiritual beings, and the teaching is that that there are people who come your way in life, and they are messengers, they are angels. Sometimes it's people who give you a very hard time, but they're angels in the sense that they're emissaries. They're here to send you a certain message, to teach you something about life, and so forth. So these angels, these divine emissaries and messengers, are telling Sarah that she's going to be a mother this time next year. And Sarah laughs on page 12, on page 79, is to say, how is it that she thinks to herself, how am I going to be pregnant if I am no longer able to conceive? I no longer have my cycle, and my husband is exceedingly old. And God says to Abram, why is it that Sarah laughs and says, how am I going to give birth and I am old? So Rashi writes something incredible. He says, Shinaha katuv midarkei shalom. God changed Sarah's words for shlom bait. Sarah said, how am I, really seriously, I'm going to be a mother? My husband is so old, he can't have kids. But God tells Abraham that Sarah said that she's old, and that's why she can't have kids. So it comes to teach us that sometimes you can cut a corner in order not to create family strife. And the next part in the Parsha is an amazing part, because a new sport is invented, a Jewish sport called chutzpah klapei shemaya. Chutzpah, audacity towards God. God is thinking to God's self, so to speak. Abram and I are so close. Isaiah, in the Bible, later on in Isaiah, Abram is the only one which is called by God Avraham Ohavi. Abram is the one person who truly loves me being God. So God is saying to God's self, allegorically speaking, I should really tell Abram that I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. By the way, it's fascinating. Sodom and Gomorrah are, the city of Sodom, that area, of course, exists to this day in Israel, and it's by the Dead Sea. It's the lowest point in the world below sea level. So it's like an interesting symbolism that a place that is described by the Bible and by the Torah is the epitome of ultimate radical moral and spiritual decadence and corruption is really physically also the lowest point in the world. And God tells Abram, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And unlike Noah, who had no reaction at all when God told him he's going to destroy the entire world except him and his family, Abraham is scandalized. And he says to him, HaShofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat, the one who judges the entire world will not act justly. Afterwards, he also expresses cosmic humility to God and says, Anochi afar va'efer, what am I, ashes and dust? I'm just an ephemeral, mortal human being with my inherent limitations. But he starts bargaining with God in that fascinating scene. What's the minimal number of innocent, decent people to reside in Sodom and Gomorrah that would justify not destroying the city? In some ways, it's the birth of collective conscience, And it's a beautiful thing. When Einstein was once asked what makes him particularly proud to be Jewish, to be of Jewish lineage and so forth, and to be part of Jewish culture, he said the desire for personal independence. The fact that we take responsibility for our lives. Just look at our community. People came here following political revolutions, following the Holocaust. We didn't just sit passively, reactively, and feel sorry for ourselves. We build lives, we build businesses, we build communities, we build families, we build synagogues. So the desire for personal independence, says Albert Einstein, is a defining feature of Jewish life and Jewish culture. The other one is the disinterested pursuit of learning for its own sake. The fact that learning for us is an inherent value. We don't just learn in order to professionalize and get a job. We learn in order to develop our minds and grow in soul. And thirdly, which is pertinent to this scene where Abram, quote-unquote, argues with God about the innocent, potentially innocent people in Sodom and Gomorrah, is that Einstein speaks about, and here I'm quoting him, our people's almost fanatical love of justice, right? And Abraham, and that's, sorry?
He said the three.
Yes. And that's what we have here. Abraham is really exemplifies this quote unquote fanatical love for justice. So after that, the angels go to Sodom, and they go to give a warning to Lot. Lot, was Abraham's nephew. They had a business falling out between Lot's shepherds and Abraham's shepherds, and Lot moved to Sodom. He saw a lot of business opportunities there. And it says here that Lot was sitting at the city of the gate. And Rashi says it means that Lot was a judge. He was a secular judge in Sodom. In other words, he became a leader. He succeeded in assimilating into the local culture. To become a judge means that you're prominent in that society. You are an expert in its laws, and you have a very noble and respectable position as the executor of justice. And the people of Sodom and Gomorrah turned their backs on Lot and his family. Those three messengers from God, actually, two of them went to Sodom, and the people of Sodom wanted to lynch them to death. And Lot does something very more than questionable. He does something abhorrent and scandalous and appalling. He says, if you want, I will release my daughters, but you cannot harm my guests. Tells us something about the ancient Near Eastern culture where your guest is like the most important thing. God forbid that you should disrespect or harm your guests. And the angels are telling Lot and his wife and his kids, his daughters, to get out of there because those places are going to be decimated and destroyed by God. And then we have the famous scene of Lot's wife. God is telling Lot and his family, I'm going to destroy this place. I want you to move out and don't turn around to look at this place. And then the Torah basically tells us that Lot's wife did a 180. She completely turned around to look at what's happening to the cities as they are destroyed, and she perished as a result. And I want to offer a very deep reflection on this. And this is that in Judaism, one of the premier mitzvot, spiritual obligations that we have is zachor, to remember, right? We sit around the Seder table, we remember we were dehumanized slaves in Egypt, we remember the Exodus. In Judaism, we carry our past with us as legacy, and we try to learn from the past and celebrate our values, but we live with the past, but we don't live in the past, right? We tell our children what happened to us in Germany, what happened to us in Russia, what happened to us in Iran, what happened to us in Egypt, what happened to us in Greece. We live with the past, we remember the past, but we don't live in the past, immersed in the past, chained, shackled, and incapacitated, hijacked by the past, God forbid. The story of Lot's wife is a story of somebody that something really bad happened to them in their family life, in their physical life, in their emotional life, in their business life, and they can't move ahead. They're stuck. They're prisoners of their past. And that's a terrible thing. We have a very healthy system in Judaism. God forbid, when there's a death, when there's a physical loss of a loved one, we really take our time to mourn and to lament and to weep. Right? We have the funeral, we have the Shiva, we have the Shloshim, we have our annual commemorations, the Yortzeit. But the idea is to let ourselves feel the pain of what happened to us, but ultimately we live with the past rather than in the past. So that's, I think, the very deep meaning of the story of Lot and his wife. And then we have these stories that reiterate themselves, where Abram takes Sarah to all sorts of places. The first one in the previous parsha, Lech Lecha, was to Egypt, and he told Sarah to tell she's his sister, so they won't murder him, to take her. And here he's going to a place called Gerar, where the king is Avimelech. And it's a very interesting scene, and I'll tell you why. Because when God appears before Avimelech, the king of Gerar, and tells him not to touch Sarah because she's a married woman and she's married to Abraham, Avimelech goes to Abram and says, "What do you think you're doing, not telling us that she's your wife? We almost had someone ask her out on a date." And what does Abram tell Avimelech? Something very interesting. On page 91, verse 11, at the very top, Abram says to Avimelech, the king of Ger, "Ki amarti rak en irat Elokim b'makom hazeh." I was thinking to myself, maybe there's no fear of God in this place. And this explains to us what fear of God is. Fear of God is basically having a conscience. Fear of God is basically saying, I am not going to do this or that because it's just the wrong thing to do. It's immoral, it's un-Jewish, it's inhumane. That's what fear of God means. And it's interesting, Maimonides actually argues that in the beginning, everybody believed in God. Maimonides has this revisionist account of the beginning of human civilization. Everyone agreed in one spiritual, infinite, abstract deity. With time, people looked at God's creations. They looked at the stars as distant planets. They looked at nature's elements, the sun, the moon. They looked at the wondrous beauty of nature. They looked at trees, and they started, instead of seeing them as intimating God as creator and God's grandeur and genius, so to speak, allegorically speaking, they started worshiping nature's elements. So, there was this degeneration, this spiritual degeneration that brought about paganism and polytheism and idolatry. And this verse in our Parsha lends credence to Maimonides' approach to the history of theology, that everybody used to be monotheists. They failed and, started being idolatrous, and Abraham basically brought humanity back to monotheism. That's Maimonides' very unique view, and maybe a proof text for it is just what we just read, that Abraham is telling Avimelech, I didn't know that there is fear of God in this place. In other words, here we have this, non-Hebrew, non-Jewish king who is well aware of the concept of God, a spiritual monotheistic God, right?
His name is Avimelech.
Avimelech, right, exactly. So, right. So that's interesting. And after that, we have the birth of Yitzchak, right? The birth of Yitzchak, Sarah's biological son, and Yitzchak was circumcised at the age of 8. Now, it's interesting, that the Torah stipulates in these two Torah portions that a Brit Milah is on the 8th day, right? Mm-hmm. And you want to ask yourself, why the 8th day? It's interesting that it's not the 7th, right? Because we have a lot of 7s, 7 days of creation, 7 days of the week. All of human civilization, by and large, divides time into 7 chief distinct units, namely years, months, weeks, days, hours, minutes, and seconds. That's 7. 7 denotes spiritual completion in this world. Shiva also, when we lose an immediate relative, we mourn intensely for 7 days. So why is Brit Milah 8? The answer is that the number 8 denotes going beyond the limitations and confinements of this world, the physical world that Kabbalah calls the world of actuality. Okay? So, for example, we have Hanukkah. Hanukkah is 8 days, and the deeper Kabbalistic meaning is that we, the Jewish people, are an eternal people, a people that will persist to exist, to quote Shakespeare, one of Shakespeare's sonnets, as long as eyes can see and man can breathe. We're an eternal people. Those we who don't live outside Israel, right? Most of the Jewish people don't live in Israel. Outside Israel, there's an 8th day of Passover, and we read on the 8th day of Passover the prophecy from Isaiah about the final redemption, where the world will be completely in geopolitical stability and peace. and human beings will be able to consecrate their bulk of their time for their growth, their spiritual growth. So, going back to the text, that's a Kabbalistic perspective, why the Brit Milah is on the 8th day. We're basically telling this infant, you know something, your life is not only going to be about the 7 days of the week, that you're going to work 5 days, and then you'll have 2 days to watch Netflix and go to the mall. Your life is going to also have an otherworldly dimension. You're also going to have a spiritual dimension to your life, hence the number 8. Your life is not going to be reduced only, strictly and exclusively to what Karl Marx called homo faber. Karl Marx defined humanity as homo faber, which means the manufacturing, producing animal. Your life is about more than that. First and foremost, you are a soul. You're a unique expression of the infinite and the eternal. There will never was, there never is, never will be anyone like you. It's like one of my favorite midrashic teachings, rabbinic teachings, is that when a human being mints a coin, a monetary coin, like 25 cents, like a quarter, they all come out pretty much the same. When God mints a human face, every face looks utterly unique. Right? So it's a very important saying. You know, because we live in America, President Coolidge once said, the business of America is business. You know, we are a country and a culture that privileges and in some ways sanctifies human productivity. One of the founding fathers of sociology, Max Weber, wrote a book about it called The Protestant Ethics and the Spirit of Capitalism. And on a more colloquial, mundane cultural level, there was a movie a few years ago with George Clooney called Up in the Air. Oh. And he plays this guy who travels all over America, and his job is to fire people. And when he fires people, they basically disintegrate. They disintegrate emotionally and mentally, not because necessarily they're worried about money. Some of them are not even necessarily worried about money, but they think that their worth stems from their economic position in society. And Clooney is trying to console one of them in that movie, and he's saying to that person, this is not a reflection on your productivity. As if being productive is the most important thing in the human experience. And comes the Torah and says, when we welcome a new Jewish infant into the world and into Jewish peoplehood, the first thing we tell them is 8. 8 is infinity. Your life is more than politics and economics and all the silly things that you see in the paper today, and they're just fleeting and nobody cares about it tomorrow. It's like we say in Israel, with yesterday's newspaper, the only thing you can do is wrap fish. It's useless. So as Mark just added as well, if you take the digit 8 and you place it instead of vertically, horizontally, then you have the scientific sign of eternity. And then we have, in our Parsha, the very heart-wrenching scene where, Hagar and Ishmael are expelled. God doesn't want, Abram doesn't want to expel Hagar and Ishmael, but God tells Abraham, Kol asher tomar elecha Sarah shma bekola. It's verse 12 on page 93. Whatever your wife Sarah tells you, you do. And from then on, Jewish men listen to their wives. On a more serious note, Vayera hadavar me'od be'enei Avraham. This thing was exceedingly bad in Abram's eyes, that Sarah, she had the spiritual acuity to understand that Yitzchak, Isaac, is cut out to continue monotheism in Judaism, and not Ishmael. Just like Rebecca figured out that Jacob is the one to continue the spiritual legacy and not Esav. The fathers don't have the spiritual lucidity that the mothers have. And Rashi says something out of this world in his commentary here. Rashi says, Melamed shegdola Sarah me'Avraham ben Nevuah. This comes to teach us that Sarah was superior to Abraham in prophecy. Sarah had greater spiritual lucidity than Abraham. And It's a very heart-wrenching scene. You have to have a heart of stone not to feel bad when you read about how Hagar gets lost in the desert with her son, and they are dehydrated, and her child is going to die from dehydration, and she just sits there and cries her eyes out almost to death until an angel comes and saves her. Right?
How old is
By the way, it doesn't say explicitly, but he's certainly teenage years and above. And it's very, very interesting that the rabbis of antiquity chose this text to be read on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, the expulsion of Hagar and Ishmael. And I think the reason they chose it for us is that on Rosh Hashanah we come to synagogue, we want to dress really nicely so we can impress our neighbors and everybody in the community. We want to look like a perfect family. We want to look physically the best. And we want to pray before God and think about our own relationship with God and our own mortality and our own health concerns and psychological concerns, economic concerns. By codifying this text for the first day of Rosh Hashanah, my opinion, I believe, is that the rabbis of antiquity are saying to us once more, look at your family. Look at the problems in your family. Fix that. That's the most important thing. Right? It's even more important than your relationship with God. First, make sure that you treat your spouse and your children and your parents with respect and with decency and with love and with kindness. Right? As the sages also teach us, derech eretz kodemet leTorah. Human decency precedes Torah. Right? I can put on tefillin all day long until 5 p.m. But if I don't treat the flesh of my flesh, my own family, with basic courtesy and respect, that I don't even have the basics covered, right? So that's a very interesting thing that our sages chose this, and it's also interesting that the Torah says here that Ishmael is going to have his own role, right? God tells Hagar, God tells Abraham, Legoy asimenu, I'm going to make him a great nation, right? So we have here the prophecy. Those who look at history or nationhood that way, that the Torah says explicitly that Ishmael legoy gadol asimenu, that Ishmael, the Ishmaelites are going to have their own might, their own strength, including demographically. Ishmael is going to be the spiritual ancestor of many peoples. Okay, now we have the final aliyah of Parashat Vayera. Is really one of the most famous, powerful, troubling, and misunderstood texts in the history of religious thought and religious narrative. The binding of Isaac, Akedat Yitzchak, not the sacrifice of Isaac. It's a key difference, right? In Christianity, at least in Catholicism, the way I understand to my limited knowledge, God sacrificed God's self on the cross. In Judaism, we need to sacrifice of ourselves to God, but certainly, first of all, Rashi says at the very beginning of the seventh Aliyah, the story of the binding of Isaac, which is on page 97 in our book, verse 1, it's chapter 22 in Genesis. First of all, we see Abram's readiness. Abram says, Hineni, here I am. Abram is a person who is present. And if you look at the second verse, God breaks the news to Abram very gradually. I want you to take your son. Which son? Your only son. Which one? The one you love. Which one? Yitzchak, not Ishmael. And Lech Lecha, to the land of the Moriah. Go to what is today the Temple Mount. Lech Lecha again. So we have two Lech Lechas. One in Parshat Lech Lecha, God is telling Abram and every Jew, I want you to go on a spiritual journey to grow in soul. And here, the Lech Lecha of the binding of Isaac, page 97, is the Lech Lecha of sacrifice. To be a Jew, you sacrifice and you put yourself in harm's way. You know, we spoke about Brit Milah. If you live in Europe and you're circumcised, you're marking yourself as a Jew. During the Holocaust, when the Nazis suspected that a person might be Jewish and they weren't sure, they would check to see if the person is circumcised. When you identify as a Jew, you are risking your life. In the last 13 months, twice neo-Nazis went inside synagogues on Shabbat in this country and murdered Jews while they were praying in synagogues. It's dangerous. In Europe, in London, in Paris, it's very dangerous to walk around with a kippah on your head. You could get beaten up, or you can get verbal abuse. Okay? So God is telling Abraham, the second Lech Lecha of being Jewish is, in addition to being Jewish, you have a spiritual calling to fulfill your God-given spiritual potential to become the best version of yourself. But it's also, you sacrifice. You make yourself vulnerable when you're Jewish and when you raise your children to be Jewish. Thank you, sorry. So now we continue, and Rashi says something very interesting. Welcome. So Rashi says that Rashi stresses the fact that we're on page 97, sir. You're very welcome. Welcome. On page 97, Rashi actually says, Lo amar shachtehu. Rashi didn't say slaughter the kid, God forbid. He says, elevate him up as an offering. That's something that's very different, right? He's saying, in a sense, he's starting here a rabbinic narrative which is a counter-narrative. If you read the pshat, the literal contextual interpretation of the binding of Isaac, then Abram is the hero supposedly because he was willing to sacrifice his son. There's only one problem with that. It doesn't work historically and culturally. Because in the ancient Near East, at that time, child and infant sacrifice was pervasive and omnipresent. It was the norm. It was the banal thing that every Joe Schmo did. The Hebrew word for hell, Gehenom, etymologically, linguistically derives from a valley close to Jerusalem called Gei Ben Hinnom, the valley of Ben Hinnom, where there was this idolatrous practices, where the various pagan civilizations would thrust their firstborn infant into the fire to appease the idols, the deities. So had Abram done this, he just would have been another guy who does that. It wouldn't have been exceptional, right? He would go to the coffee bean and said, today I burnt my kid. Oh, I burnt my kid last week, the guy sitting next to him would say. The fact that Abram heeds what philosopher Martin Heidegger called the call of conscience. When the angel says to Abram, Avaham, Avaham, right? The Torah reiterates twice to emphasize urgency and primacy and importance. Abram, Abram, do not thrust your hand unto the youth. Don't do it. That's the revolutionary moment in religious history. The God of Abraham, the God of monotheism, the Jewish people, and the universe is telling the world's first monotheist and Jew, Abraham, child sacrifice, human sacrifice, that's exactly what I don't want. And as the 42nd president of this great country, George W. Bush, used to say, make no mistake about it. Child sacrifice continues to this day. We have child soldiers in Africa. During the Iran-Iraq war, the Iranian regime would snatch teenagers, 13-year-olds playing soccer in the street, to go blow themselves on the minefields in the Iran-Iraq war, and they told them, Allah will take you to heaven. Here's a token, wrap it around your neck, you'll be fine. In radical Islam today, we have radical factions who tell their own flesh and blood kids, teenagers, go commit mass suicide to murder civilians. You tell a 12, 13, 14-year-old to blow themselves up, that's child sacrifice. But let's wait a little bit, please. Let's remember, maybe it's not child sacrifice in a ritualistic sense like it was in antiquity, but in essence, the end result is the same. We're taking children, we're corrupting them, we are exploiting them for our own political and military follies, right? Another perspective on the binding of Isaac is that, not in a physical sense, God forbid, but we spoke earlier about the cult of productivity in America and in the West, and how we're basically being brainwashed that our worth and intrinsic dignity derives from our socioeconomic status and our income, and whether we have alluring credentials like CEO or professor, or whether, and we dedicate so much of our lives to what could become the false idol of our career. A career is a great thing. God tells humanity at the opening chapter of the Hebrew Bible, of the Torah, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth and conquer it and subdue it. Use your God-given intellect to form civilization, both physically and culturally, right? And that's a good thing. But when we get to a point where we're so insecure and imbalanced that we dedicate more to our professional and economic advancement than to be with our children, then that's a form of spiritual and emotional sacrifice. We're sacrificing our family's well-being. We're sacrificing the quality of the relationship between us and our children and our spouses, and it is then that, economic growth and professional growth, career growth becomes an idol and a fetish rather than a worthy and legitimate goal. Once we lose that perspective. And of course, if we neglect our children for our work, I'm not talking very busy, but to the point of neglect, that we're also damaging them for life. They will carry with them for the rest of their lives that emotional deficit, that daddy was never there for me. He didn't come to my baseball game, he didn't come to my play at the shul. Whenever I talked to him or to mom, they were on the phone or whatever, and I was always made to feel I am last and I am least important. Right? So that's another thing that we can learn from the binding of Isaac. I want to give you another very powerful interpretation that we have in the story of the binding of Isaac, and that's on page 97, verse 3. It says that Abram arose early in the morning and he saddled his donkey, right? He prepared his car. And first of all, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs wrote in his commentary for this week that the fact that when Abraham and Isaac traveled for the binding of Isaac with two other people, and the Midrash, Rashi, says that they were Ishmael, right, Abraham's firstborn son, and Eliezer, Abraham's butler, chief servant, right? And at some point, Abraham tells Eliezer and Ishmael, you guys stay here with your iPhones and watch Netflix or go on YouTube, and Yitzchak and I are going to go up the mountain to engage in an offering. And Isaac asks Abraham, where is the seh? Where is the goat we're going to sacrifice? And Abraham doesn't flinch and says, God will show us the goat that we're going to sacrifice. And what happens at the end? A deer is being sacrificed, right? And the Torah says also that the deer's horn got stuck in the bushes there, right? And that's one of the proof texts for sounding the shofar during the month of Elul and Rosh Hashanah and the end of Yom Kippur, right? It's on the merit of Abraham's altruism, willing to do everything for God, that we ask for God's compassion and forgiveness. But the fact that Abraham told Isaac, God will show us the goat, intimates, according to Rabbi Sachs, one of the premier Jewish theologians and thinkers of our time, that Abraham may well have had a premonition that this is not going to happen. That the monotheistic God of humanity and Judaism desires not child sacrifice, unlike the pagan gods, right? So that's another point. Now, as I was saying, in verse 3 it says, Abram arose early in the morning and he saddled his donkey, Vayachavosh et chamuro. Don Yitzchak Abarvanel, who was a leading Spanish commentator, he was also an Alan Greenspan of Saul. He was the Secretary of Treasury for Portugal, and then he became personal advisor for the King and Queen of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabel. He pleaded them, to repeal the expulsion from Spain in 1492, and he was a great figure. And Prime Minister Netanyahu's father, Professor Ben Zion Netanyahu of blessed memory, who was an intellectual friend of mine, lived to be 102. He specialized in the Spanish Inquisition. His masterpiece, he was at Cornell University, is called the Origins of the Spanish Inquisition. But Professor Netanyahu's doctorate was on Abarvanel. And what the way Abarvanel reads this verse is, what does it mean? It's a pun. Vayachavosh et chamoro in Hebrew means he saddled his donkey. He prepared his car for the long ride to Palm Springs. But so Don Yitzchak Abarvanel, the great writer, says, and commentator, rabbinic commentator, says, Vayachavosh et chamoro means vayichbosh et chumriyuto. It sounds almost the same. It's like a homonym. He conquered his materiality, his physicality. He superseded his nature, right? He was willing to exemplify incredible, towering devotion, right? And that's what people do when they reach a certain threshold. They're willing to take incredible risks, physical risks to their own flesh, to serve a cause greater than themselves. That's what the soldiers on D-Day in Normandy did. Those American and British and French and Canadian and New Zealand and soldiers, they stormed the shores of Normandy, and so many of them were killed instantaneously. They did it for the people back home, so that human civilization as we know it can persist. Right? You had the raid on Entebbe airport in Uganda in 1976. You had the Israeli commandos storming African soldiers and German and Palestinian terrorists, holding over 100 Jews ransom in exchange, presumably, for the release of people who murdered other civilians in terrorist acts. Why were they putting their life in harm's way? For people they never met in their lives. They didn't know those hostages in Entebbe. So to conquer one's nature is to be willing to give up your own life for a supreme human, spiritual, and moral value that you feel is more important than your very physical existence. And that's why in the Kabbalah, Yitzchak, Isaac, represents the divine emanation, an attribute of din or gvura. Gvura literally means heroism, because there are midrashic rabbinic readings which postulate that Isaac was an adult, and he suspected what might be the plan, and still he was willing to go ahead with it. So he represents the supreme ability to sacrifice for a greater good, right? I have to go to an important meeting with the Consul General, so I just want to say one thing before I leave, please. In the Haftarah, the prophetic reading for this week, which you can find on page 1061, it's page 1061. It's taken from the second book of Kings, okay? And we don't know exactly when the Haftarah, the prophetic readings for the Jewish Sabbath, were codified. We conjecture it may have been in the 2nd century of the Common Era, during the time of the Adrianic persecutions, when the Romans forbade practice and learning and teaching of Torah by penalty of death. So the rabbis needed to bypass the system. So if we can't read from the Torah, let's read from the prophetic literature. So this is from the 2nd book of Kings. The prophet Elijah, who is the chief disciple, the prophet Elisha, who is the chief disciple of Elijah the prophet, finds himself in this situation where this woman took massive loans, her husband died, she's covered in debt, she asked for his help. Essentially, the kid at this point in this story from the 2nd book of Kings we're going to read this Sabbath has cardiac arrest, and Elisha resuscitates him, and he comes back to life. It's the first recorded act of CPR from the ancient Near East. And so the reason the rabbis chose for us this scriptural reading to coincide with the binding of Isaac and the Torah portion of Vayera is that there are some midrashic rabbinic stories that Isaac actually died physically and came back to life. Yeah. So a child is saved miraculously and another child is saved miraculously. What I want to tell you is this, is that this woman is coming to Elisha the prophet, and she's beside herself. She tells the prophet, I'm covered in debt, my husband is gone, and now the Noshe is the creditor. He's going to come take my 2 sons as servants. Back in the ancient world, today there's a joke, if you can't pay your restaurant bill, you have to go and wash the dishes for 6 hours, whatever. You have to compensate somehow. So back then, people would become servants of the people that they owed money to. That's how they would pay them, right? Thank God we no longer live in such an era. But the point is that the prophet is telling her, maybe there's something you can sell in your house. Maybe you have valuable jewelry or some commodities. And he tells her, Ma yesh lach babayit, which is Hebrew for what do you have at home? And Rabbi Professor Norman Lamb, who was one of the main students of Rabbi Soloveitchik, the greatest modern Jewish theologian in the second half of the 20th century had known, has an ingenious interpretation here. When the prophet is asking the Jewish parent, what do you have at home? He's asking each and every one of us, what do your children have at home? What do they see? Do they only have computer and video games at home? Do they only have a swimming pool at home, or beautiful marble floor, or parquet floor, and huge TV sets, and fancy cars? Is that what they have at home? Or do they also have at home mother and father who talk to each other with gentility and affection and respect? Do they also have at home parents who speak about other people in the presence of their children in kind ways? Do they have parents at home who pray or exercise yoga or do some sort of a spiritual mindfulness exercise? Do they have parents that have books at home on the wall? Do they have parents who read? What do you have at home? Right? We live now in a time where people are so obsessed, rightfully, on getting their kids the best math tutor so they can get to the best high school and the best college. And we take our children on luxurious vacations. But that's not a good thing, you know why? Our kids would enjoy just as much if they stay at a 2-star hotel somewhere, as long as they're having fun with a family. That's what a vacation is really about. When we take our kids on super expensive vacations, they develop material attachment to it. When we take our kids too frequently to restaurants, I'm not saying not to take, but too frequently, they develop material attachments to eating in restaurants. When we take our kids on business class when they're kids to Europe, they develop material attachment to traveling business class. These things are not good for the soul. What do we have at home? That's a great, great question that we want to ask ourselves, for ourselves, and that we want to ask ourselves also as parents and grandparents and Jewish educators and human educators. So these were some chief highlights, principally from Parshat Vayera, but also from last week's Parshat Lech Lecha. Okay, so thank you all for coming, and Shabbat Shalom. And